Hello and welcome! In this video, I'm going to explain my process in rendering this photo into an ink drawing, using the stippling technique. Ink is a very unforgiving medium, but there's a few steps we can take to make the actual inking portion super easy. The basic process I'm going to be showing is 1. Doing a detailed sketch, 2. Transferring that sketch onto a final ink board, and 3. Actually inking the image. But first, let's look at the materials we'll need. We're going to want to have 3 different types of graphite pencils, an HB, a 3B, and a 5B. The HB is great for the initial sketch, but these other 2 graphite types are a bit softer and offer darker darks to give your piece a more dimensional look. So here when we do kind of showing an example is if we do a gradient with just the HB pencil. You can see my darkest dark of me pressing as hard as I can and really building up the graphite. It's not very dark. There is a gradient, there is a difference, but it's not very substantial. But going and doing the same thing with the 3B, you can immediately see that that darker dark is very different than the one above it. And even still, the 5B is darker yet. Using these 3 different graphite pencils, you're going to get a really dimensional look to your drawing, because you'll actually be able to capture the darkness of the shadows in contrast with the highlights, really capturing the light going over the surface of your subject. You want a pencil sharpener. I like this brass sharpener, and erasers. I like to have 2 different sizes, a smaller one for more detailed erasing in smaller areas, or just a larger one. Both work great. Another tool you can use, which I kind of like for the final steps of the drawing, are blenders. These are basically just compressed pieces of paper, and you use this sandpaper pad to erase them or sharpen them, meaning erase the graphite off the tips, and you just go over your drawing with the blending tool, and it blends the graphite quite nicely. It also pulls out a little bit of the graphite so you can do some detail work in highlighted areas. And I use these blending tools as one of the final steps in the graphite drawing. For inking, I use a nib pen with India ink. I really prefer the nib pen because it's a really sustainable option. The handle's made out of wood and cork, which is compostable, and then it has a changeable metal tip or nib, which can be recycled. It's common to use micron pens, which don't have a lot of ink in them, and so unfortunately they just have to be tossed out when they run out of ink. But using a nib pen or dip pen, you can get these large bulk containers of ink, and you're not creating as much trash. You can also make your own ink from walnut or beet. Maybe you could use coffee. You also don't have to be using these types of ink with a nib pen. You can use gouache or watercolor. I have some gouache over here, and all you do is add a little bit of water, and a little bit goes a long way. And it's really cool to add a little bit of color to your piece. So with this bulk ink that I have, I just pour a little bit into a glass jar and work from there. When you're inking, you'll want to make sure that you dip your pen just about halfway into the nib where the ink goes along this ridge portion. Hold it over your jar to have any excess ink drip back into your jar. Then test out some stipples onto some scratch pieces of paper. Sometimes you capture a bit too much ink and it'll flood onto your paper, or sometimes you don't have very much and it comes out just as an indent into your page. So do a little testing before you actually go on your final piece. If your ink is a bit old, it can clog up the nib a bit sooner, and you might have to wash out your nib every 20 minutes, but if you have some fresh ink, it should last a good hour or so. Step 1. Sketch out and outline the basic shapes with the HB pencil. This is identifying what space you're going to be working in. You're going to outline the entire shape of what you're drawing and Outline also the shadows, the dark areas, and maybe even any highlights. I use a grid method for this. This method is great for working from a photograph. You place a grid on top of a photo and a grid on whatever space you're working. I'm actually using grid paper, so it makes it quite easy. And this works great because you're focusing just on the shapes and the squares, not putting in any type of preconceived notion on what the perspective would be. You're just looking at the shapes and the squares, and it gives you a more accurate drawing. Step 2. Use the softer pencil, the 3B, to add in depth. Darken the darks and add in details. So you got your basic outline sketch done from the grid method or whatever method you're using, but now it's looking a bit flat, so you need to darken those dark areas and identify the shadows and highlights. Step 3, you basically do this process over and over until you like it and it feels accurate. Are those dark shadows actually the darkest things on your paper? Do you have a highlight in the eye if there is an eye in your piece? Step 4 is prepare the transfer. We won't be inking onto the drawing you just did. We're going to preserve that piece and ink on a completely different surface. So to do this, we make a transfer. So you're going to tape a piece of tracing paper on top of your drawing on a flat surface. You're going to want to make sure that both pieces are secure on all edges. Trace the shapes of your drawing, filling in the dark areas. Once that's done, you flip over the tracing paper and rub graphite on the back, making sure all of your lines are covered. Step 5. Transfer the image onto your final piece. So if you're using illustration board or watercolor paper, you just tape the messy side down onto your watercolor paper and make sure again that all sides and corners are secure. Carefully trace over your initial trace. It doesn't need to be super forceful, just kind of go over the lines once again. And yes, fill in those darker areas if you had them on your initial trace. You'll want to lift up the taped corners every now and then to make sure it's transferring properly. With the pressure of your pencil against the graphite on the other side of the tracing paper, this transfers or sticks to the illustration board. This is great because it gives you a clean blueprint to work over with ink. It preserves your initial sketch and it doesn't indent the board. Step 6. This is optional, but it's always a good idea to mask out your edges. This keeps your white edges white from any graphite smudges or accidental ink drops. You can just take some extra tracing paper or any type of paper and cover up the edges, tape them down that you won't be working in. Step 7 is ink and stippling. Stippling is just a collection of small dots, relatively equally spaced, covering your lines and filling in the dark spaces. So you want to go light first. It's very hard to erase ink. You can potentially with using an X-Acto knife and maybe a white gel pen, but it's always good to go light first and build up your darks. Step 8 is building up your darks. So this is basically the same process we did with the graphite drawing. Start light, have your basic outline, and then build up those dark shadows, those dark areas, and slowly add in details. And the piece will start to take shape. You want to focus on your darkest darks and using your shadows as reference points. Nothing should be darker than the shadows. Step 9, you're finished when you feel done. If you feel that your darks are dark, you have an accurate representation, then you're good. Unmask it and erase the underlying graphite. Step 10, try this method out. It's super time consuming, but protects your work along the way, and you have a couple really cool pieces. Start small and simple and work your way up. Maybe from a flower from your garden, or even something as simple as an egg can be great practice. Thanks for watching.